everybody was coming and going, and then COVID.
Hey, Becky.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Corey is wrapping up another meeting before he joins in.
Oh, great.
I am trying
Did you see the photos I added to the slide deck, and were you okay with those?
Yes, I did. So thank you.
Sorry, I was so late on that. I'm a procrastinator.
Like, I'm coming in sideways on 2 wheels today, so there's no, I get it.
Fair enough.
I think you have the ability to assign. Okay. We've got a bunch of people. I'm not going to let anybody in until we get a little bit closer to time, but we've got a bunch of folks sitting in the waiting room.
Awesome.
I guess I can't. Trying to make sure that Lauren has the ability to be a host, and Corey passed the hosting duties over to me, and I want to make sure that I pass them. I'm so used to Teams.
when somebody comes on, you can make them a co-host.
Okay.
In the participants tab, if you
All right.
If you see them more, usually that gives you the option when they're on to make them a host or a co-host.
Okay. Sorry, another app is going weird. Lauren was having some technical issues right before this, and her camera was super laggy, so she was trying to restart and get back.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm gonna pause. Perfect.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Hello and welcome.
You might want to wait for everybody's audio to connect.
Oh yeah, that's true. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. I think I will. Here we go. All right, good morning. As everyone's coming in, thanks for being here. I see Dr. Curley.
Hey!
Great to see everyone here. If you don't mind muting yourself as you come in, we're going to kick things off here in within the next minute. But yeah, thanks for being here with us this morning and sharing your time with us. Can you see my screen, Annie?
I cannot. It says that you're sharing your screen, but I can't actually see it.
I was hoping to share this with some students. About 10:30, they'll be coming in. I don't know how long the meeting will last, but I thought it'd be fun for some high school students to at least watch what's going on.
Great. I have a supplemental document that you can give to your students after they watch this if you want, Dr. Curley. That's
awesome. Now we can see some stuff more.
They got like 4 days left of school. They don't care about your document.
Got to hold the bar high. All right, so you see my screen.
I see your screen. It's not in presentation mode. I see your screen.
This is what happens when I go through the pandemic using Teams and not Zoom. What about now? Can you see it now?
You're awesome.
Oh, yes. I know, I'm late to the Zoom game. I'm late. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this party started. Again, thanks everyone for being here. This is the North Carolina Climate Education Network open house for May, and we will be focused on talking about drought. We have two very special guests with us today, Corey Davis and Becky Bollinger, and they will be introducing themselves to us in just a moment. Let's see if I can get things started here. So basically, the North Carolina Climate Education Network is a group. It's led by myself, Annie Lee, who's in the Division of Air Quality, and Rebecca Ward, who's in the North Carolina State Climate Office. And we started working together to just kind of connect educators across North Carolina with various environmental scientists and research going on. So go ahead and be sure to register with us if you're not already on our mailing list, and you'll stay in the loop with upcoming events, open houses just like this. They're pretty casual. We're not too fancy. Annie Lee, would you like to introduce yourself a little more?
Sure. I'm Annie Lee. I'm with the Division of Air Quality, specifically the Air Awareness team. I specialize in teacher workshops and education on both energy and climate change, especially as it pertains to air quality.
And we don't have Miss Rebecca Ward with us today. We're thinking about her though, because she has recently had a little one. So she'll be coming back later on this summer, we hope, but definitely excited for her new beginnings. And myself, Lauren Daniel. So I work in the Division of Water Resources, and I am the education program coordinator. I guess that's my title. But I run various education programs throughout the state. I plug in like Project WET, NC Streamwatch, networks like this, North Carolina Climate Ed Network, into various watershed groups, formal classroom teachers, and just anyone who wants to learn more about environmental education with regards to water. And also, quick plug, I have like 2 or 3 more spaces left for the Climate, Water, and Resiliency Workshop. I will have the link to register for that in the hyperdoc that we will be providing to supplement this. Okay. All right, so this is my favorite part. I'm going to hand it over to Annie. But a while back, I asked Annie if she could start just bringing us up to speed, keeping us hip with what's the latest with climate issues in our state and around the area. So Annie, you want to talk this?
I'll jump in. Real fast, I want to take a second to just recognize that today might be a particularly difficult day for some of us who are dropping kids off at school or stepping foot into a school building. Just want to recognize the events of yesterday, and I really appreciate all of our educators for continuing to show up. As a classroom teacher for 10 years, I am right there with you with all of the feels. So anyway, moving into our minute on climate. Normally I try and do something that's international, national, and that's local. But frankly, we've got so much going on within our state that I focused on what's going on within North Carolina. One really big thing is that the moratorium for offshore wind that President Trump put in 2020 was lifted earlier this spring. And then in April 2022, last month, the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management opened North Carolina's coast up for leasing. And so there are actually auctions have actually started on land offshore of North Carolina for new offshore wind energy projects, which is wonderful for climate action and bringing down emissions and still having reliable energy resources. Another big thing that came out is Duke Energy actually came out with a carbon proposal on how they're going to bring down their carbon emissions. It's really robust. I invite you to go check it out yourself. But their goal is to reduce their carbon emissions by 70% by 2030, have neutrality by 2050. This includes increasing the amount of solar 3 times over. It involves a plan of small nuclear modules, small nuclear reactors. And let me be clear, this plan has 4 different scenarios, and it's kind of trying to figure out kind of the best way forward. It also includes a lot of hydrogen capable natural gas units that would start off using natural gas, not necessarily the hydrogen. There's a lot of concern because natural gas is still really methane heavy, and that's a really intense greenhouse gas. There's also a lot of question about whether or not portable nuclear reactors are if they've been tested enough or if they're still experimental. So there's a lot of positive in here. There's a lot of questions in here. I invite you to keep an ear out for it. So, and it catches you up.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks for keeping us hip here. Let's keep moving. Uh-oh, there we go. So let's kick things off about our main topic today. We're going to be talking about drought. And before we get into the components of our agenda, I would love to just tap on Corey and Becky to, tell us your names, where you work, and yeah, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm Corey Davis. I'm Assistant State Climatologist at the North Carolina State Climate Office. Excited to be here joining everyone. Today's work really combines 2 different parts of my job. One of those is science communication. I spend a lot of time giving talks like this to people about North Carolina's weather and climate, and also write and edit our office's climate blog. So if you're not subscribed to that, I'd encourage you to go sign up. We put out a post every couple of weeks to every month about recent weather and climate events and what I think is a pretty fun and easy to read format. The other part of my job that's relevant today is acting as our office's representative on North Carolina's Drought Management Advisory Council. This is a group that includes a lot of different state and federal agencies that work with drought monitoring across the state. We make weekly recommendations to the U.S. Drought Monitor and also set North Carolina's drought status every week. So again, well-versed in drought and excited to be here.
That's awesome. Corey, thanks for being here. And let me turn it over to Becky.
Hi, I am Becky Bollinger, and I am basically what Corey is, but in Colorado. I'm way out west where it's 8 o'clock in the morning. So sorry if I don't seem quite put together yet. But yeah, I do a lot of communication with climate here at Colorado State Climate Office, which is called the Colorado Climate Center. And we also spend a lot of time with, climate communication, monitoring the climate, monitoring drought. And, we have drought in our state more often than we don't. So it is something that we are also very familiar with.
Interesting. Excellent. Well, thanks, Becky. And thanks for waking up early and being with us. Feel free to go refill your coffee at any
Well, thanks.
But what we're going to be talking about are three main points. We're going to be talking about drought in general and how it compares in North Carolina to the western part of the US. We're also going to be talking about drought management and the process that goes behind identifying drought and talking about different aspects of monitoring it. And then, y'all, my favorite part, I'm really looking forward to clearing up some common misconceptions about drought and just hearing straight from the experts, the drought whisperers, if you will, on what the truth is behind drought. For those of you who registered to be here today, we asked you some questions during the registration form, and I found it was really interesting that the number one interest from everyone signing up to be here was y'all are interested in future projections of drought. Number two, you're curious to learn about the human impacts that cause drought. And number three, the indicators used to determine drought. Those are going to be three main things that we'll definitely hit on. And then another thing I found interesting from your registration data was the number one thing you want to be more confident about is understanding the relationship between drought and climate. So as we move forward, let's keep those things in mind as we, asked you on the front end what you were interested in learning about. So that brings us to our first activity. Annie, do you want to kick this off here? And Corey and Becky, we want you to chime in too as we lead this.
So basically we've got some images here that show pictures of drought. What we would like for you to do is to type into the chat, which ones do you think actually show drought conditions? We're gonna obviously let Becky and Corey take the lead on this in the discussion portion.
Give you
and while you're going through and thinking about this, I'll say, drought's kind of unique because if we were to do this same exercise for, say, a snowstorm, which images show a snowstorm, it would be extremely easy. If we were to do this about a hurricane, it would be pretty easy as well because we know what hurricane impacts tend to be. But with drought, it's a little bit different. Sometimes the impacts are not the same everywhere. Sometimes it's tough to know what the impacts are. So curious to get everyone's thoughts about exactly what drought looks like, especially from these pictures.
Oh, okay. I'm seeing most folks are putting at least 2 or 3 things in, and a couple folks are saying all of these images.
I particularly love the D picture because so many people are like, oh yeah, that's drought. And I'm like, really, that actually looks pretty lush and green to me. That could be pretty normal conditions in Colorado.
It's a good difference in your lens. Yeah, great. So let me move the slide here. Go ahead and get your guesses in. Oh, Marty is here from Texas. All right, let's move forward. Oops, nope, not there. You can't see my chat screen, right? Okay, good. All right, here are the answers.
Yeah, so we color coded these. The green ones are pictures that for sure represent drought, at least in North Carolina. The top left one is Falls Lake near Raleigh during the 2007 drought. Very, very low water levels. That's the type of event you'll only see usually in a long-lived multi-year drought event. The middle picture, obviously the corn that's pretty much shriveled up. Another thing that definitely shows signs of drought conditions. And then the one on the bottom right, This was a picture from the mountains back in the fall of 2016. They were in a pretty bad drought then, and then started to see some wildfires. So wildfires aren't always an indicator of drought, but in this case, this is a sign that conditions were dry enough to burn. The two yellow pictures are ones that could be signs of drought. I'll start at the bottom left. This is one that, Becky just talked about. In some areas, seeing vegetation this green with water still flowing through a stream, in drier climates, that may be perfectly fine for certain times of the year. In other places, especially during the summer in North Carolina, this could be a sign we're starting to get a little bit dry, maybe getting into drought conditions, but we can't say for sure that that's what drought would look like. And then at the top right, just seeing a lawn that's turned yellow or brown. Again, this could be a sign that drought conditions have set in, but depending on the type of grass and the local climate, this could also just be what you expect during some times of the year. And even during the summertime, we may go a couple weeks without seeing much rainfall. Your lawn may turn yellow, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're in a drought yet. And then finally, the one in the middle on the bottom is a desert. This is one of the misconceptions we may talk about later, but deserts are not constantly in a state of drought just because they don't get a lot of rainfall. This is something Becky may be able to talk more about, being in the West, but we don't always see drought, even though you're in a dry climate.
Excellent. Thanks, Corey. Corey, did you say that top left one was Falls Lake in Raleigh?
It is. It just amazing to think how low it had gotten. Most of the main part of the lake had just reduced to basically just a stream going through it. This had been after probably at least a year of really dry conditions and some really hot summers there as well. So if you're around the Raleigh area or anywhere in North Carolina back in 2007, 2008, you remember how bad the restrictions were, a lot of water use, water conservation taking place. So yeah, just amazing to look back on these pictures and think how bad it was.
All right, and let's move the slide. Let's see, Becky, I think Becky put some, here we go. Becky, do you want to talk a little bit about these?
I did not color code these for anything. I just added different color borders. But I wanted to kind of highlight what drought in the West might look like. The upper left corner is a picture of a creek that is in southern Colorado, and this picture was taken just a few weeks ago. This is a time of year where a ditch like this should be really bursting with water because the snow has been melting, and so it should have much more water in it than it does. And so that is one indicator of drought. Another common misconception that I wanted to address with the top middle picture is that you can't have drought in winter, or if you have snow on the ground, you might not have drought. This picture is in the San Juan Mountains. I took this picture on April 1st, and you can see that there is snow in the trees and snow on the ground, and it looked really good. And then it melted incredibly quickly and early. And so this region is in a drought right now. The lower left, it might be hard to see, but that is a snow, somebody's doing a snow study there, and they've dug a hole to analyze the levels of the snowpack. And on top of the snow, you can see a level of dust. And even though there is quite a depth of snow there, the level of dust on top means that you will lose more of that snow to the atmosphere from sublimation. So if you think of going from a liquid to a gas is evaporation, we're talking about water. Going from a solid to a gas, snow to vapor is sublimation, and then we can't use that water. And so that is a drought impact. In Colorado, we also have major reservoirs to store water during times in drought or times where we don't get as much snow. And so the bottom picture shows our largest reservoir in the state, and it is at near record level lows right now. And so it will, that is because we were in drought last year, and because we're still in drought, it likely won't fill from the snow melt this year. And then finally, Corey referenced wildfire, which is something that is a natural part of the ecosystem. As he said, we do get wildfires every year, but in drought conditions, they are particularly more devastating. They spread faster, they're harder to control, they're hotter. And so this was one of our fires in Southwest Colorado back in our 2018 drought. And while we were there looking at conditions, as you can see, this fire was contained, and then a little hot spot popped up while we were there talking about it. So those are just some images I wanted to share of Western drought.
That's really interesting, Becky. And I noticed what you said about, I just kind of, it resonated with me how you said that if the snowpack melts quickly or early, so that will, minimize how much is able to be soaked into the soil. So that time, that sequence and timing has a lot to do with it.
Yes.
Interesting. Well, I tell you what, how about if we, I keep trying to click. How about if we dive a little deeper into, what you do and your role as far as drought management goes, monitoring. Corey, if you could kind of kick things off here and dive a little deeper into what you do to monitor drought, because you do it year round. What is that?
That's right. In fact, in North Carolina and in a lot of states, we actually do it every week because the U.S. Drought Monitor maps are updated on a weekly basis. North Carolina has long been considered one of the national leaders in drought monitoring. So I'll give you an idea of how that process works in our state. Again, we have this group called the North Carolina Drought Management Advisory Council. It's actually written into state law that we are the group that has authority over issuing drought advisories and setting the statewide drought status. And this came after some of those really bad droughts 10, 15, 20 years ago, where we realized how impactful drought could be and the need to monitor it better. The North Carolina Drought Council has representatives from, like I said, a number of different state and federal agencies that work across the state. One of those where I work is at the State Climate Office. So when we do our weekly calls to talk about drought conditions, usually I'll talk about how much rain has fallen in the last week, the last month, sometimes the last 3 months, 6 months. Just looking at these different time periods and seeing if we can find parts of the state that consistently look dry. We will also look at impact reports from across the state. So for instance, right now, parts of the coastal plain look very dry. We can go and find what's been reported in those areas. Are people's gardens struggling? Are they having to water their lawns more often? Are they seeing, say, the creek in their backyard running low? All these things sort of help validate what some of the precipitation indicators show. We'll also get an idea from the National Weather Service on what they're seeing. Is the rain coming like we're expecting? Is there rain expected in the next week? We don't consider that forecast rain when we do the weekly drought maps, but it's still important to know what type of pattern we're in and whether that's conducive for drought continuing. The U.S. Geological Survey has stream gauges all across the state, so they'll talk about what the water levels are like on these streams. Are they increasing in response to rain events like we saw earlier this week? Are they continuing to stay low like we have at the coastal plain where we really haven't seen that much rain lately? And then they'll also look at groundwater levels. Groundwater turns out to be one of our best indicators of drought conditions because it's not flashy like a stream. It can take a little bit longer to respond to rainfall, so it really gives us a better idea of where drought has truly settled in and where it'll take a little bit longer to improve. We'll hear from folks at the North Carolina Division of Environmental Quality. They operate some of their own groundwater wells and stream gauges across the state. We'll hear from different reservoir operators. In North Carolina, we have a number of different groups, including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Duke Energy, in the western part of the state, the Tennessee Valley Authority. They all manage reservoirs in different parts of the state, so they'll give us a sense of where those lake levels stand, how their inflows are looking, and again, that can sort of tell us what the impacts are to water supplies. And then also we'll hear from agriculture and forestry to get a feel for what drought impacts are for farmers and also for fire conditions. And again, that helps us validate some of the other reports that we're getting. And then finally, we'll hear about whether any local water systems have implemented conservation or restriction measures. And again, that can sort of help justify what a drought status is in certain areas. So after that, we'll take all of that information that we've heard. And our job is to try to condense it into a single map. You've probably seen these color-coded US drought monitor maps. They range from abnormally dry conditions, which means we're not in drought, but it's just a little bit drier than normal, all the way to these extreme and exceptional drought events. Fortunately, we haven't had those in North Carolina in several years, but in the Western US, that's becoming more common. They've dealt with that for a while. And basically the way we do that, condensing into a single map is what the US Drought Monitor calls a convergence of evidence approach. We want to look at all these different indicators at different timescales and see which ones agree with each other, where we're seeing agreement across the board and in different locations across the state, and determine for those areas which drought status, which drought category makes the most sense. So these calls every Tuesday afternoon usually last anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. And then we'll have correspondence with the US Drought Monitor authors as well to make sure that North Carolina is depicted as accurately as it can be on the maps that come out every Thursday morning. So that's a little bit about how the process works in North Carolina.
Corey, you just did a great job of explaining something that is that has many moving parts. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, because I've sat in on a few of these drought calls and it's kind of magical. That might not be the right word, but how you have all of these different partners coming together. You just rattled off like TVA, DEQ, various members of the agricultural community, and many more. You come together and you all talk about what you're seeing in your scope. And then you like pull up a map and you start putting in like, if there's any, red flags, and then you make a map. And then you take that map and then you send it off to the National Drought Monitor. Is that correct?
That's right. It probably sounds a little like, magic, but we've been doing this for 20 some years now. We were doing weekly virtual meetings long before the pandemic made everybody do weekly virtual meetings. So we've sort of got it down to a science now. Another thing that helps is that we do have the previous week's drought monitor map always to use as a starting point. For the most part, those maps don't change a lot from one week to another. But for instance, last week, we started to see that parts of Western North Carolina in the mountains were getting a little bit drier. So we added some abnormally dry classification in those areas. Now, the rains that moved through over the weekend means we're going to see some improvements there this week. But again, going based off the previous week's map gives us a good starting point, and then we can look at what has happened in the most recent monitoring period and make those tweaks as needed.
Excellent. That's awesome. And if we could take a quick technical pause, because I thought I pinned you to the screen, but it might not have done it just right. But I want to shift things over to Becky and ask you, Becky, the same kind of question. What does drought monitoring look like in Colorado? How is it similar to what Corey just said? And then I'm sure that there are some differences as well. I'm going to try to spotlight you now.
Yeah, so it's, I'm going to put mine back on gallery view. Every time you pin it, switches mine off of gallery view. Like I want to see everybody. I wanted to share because I did drought recommendations for Colorado yesterday, and my iPad and Apple Pencil are my friend. So you can see our drought map, and then I just started coloring and drawing, and we had both improvements and areas that saw worsening drought conditions in the same week. We had, this is probably going to sound shocking to you, but we had a big snowstorm last week, which is, not uncommon for Colorado in May, albeit frustrating because we're all ready for summer. But what Corey described is really very similar to what we do in Colorado. I would say that while the Colorado Climate Center has been in operation since 1974, we have really gotten into drought monitoring on that weekly basis since 2009 is when we really started that. And we also have a method, it's really led by our office, and we every Tuesday morning start to look at all the conditions. Why is this happening on Tuesday is one of the things I wanted to kind of highlight, because the US Drought Monitor map comes out on Thursday morning, and that map is based on conditions as of Tuesday morning. So there has to be a cutoff. You know, you can't consider rain that fell on Wednesday for the Thursday morning map. And so we wait for that cutoff on Tuesday morning, and then we know that we have all the information from the last week needed to consider any changes that may be made to that current map. Like Corey said, we don't start a map from scratch. We really start from last week. And it's the same thing. We start looking at, you know, what happened in the last week, what's happened in the last month, what's happened on longer time scales, and how are things changing and evolving. You know, we look at a lot of the same indicators. I would say that the biggest difference for Colorado is that snowpack from October through June is a very important drought indicator that we look at every single week. It's one of the reasons, because that is for Western United States, one of our primary water resources. And one of the things that makes Colorado really unique is that we are known as a headwaters state, which means we have the starting point of 5 major rivers: the Rio Grande River, the Colorado River, the Arkansas River, the South Platte River. I'm forgetting one. But they all start in the mountains of our beautiful state, and then they all flow out of our state. And what that means is where it starts, then all the states it goes out to, everybody wants a piece of the pie. And these rivers are not like the Mississippi. They're not huge, but they are so incredibly important that they are monitored constantly, and we're constantly assessing how that snowpack in the mountains is going to translate to runoff in our rivers, and then how we're going to capture that in our reservoirs that we then save for our needs. And our needs tend to be in the summer, right? We need irrigation water in the summer, not just for your houses, your lawns, but we also need irrigation for a lot of our crops. And so when we get the water is not when we use the water. And so that is why snowpack is such an important piece of the puzzle in drought monitoring in our state. One of the other key differences that I think is so interesting is that we do have the Army Corps of Engineers out here, but most of our reservoirs are actually managed by the Bureau of Reclamation, which was a federal entity basically created to manage water in the West. And so the Bureau of Reclamation is not really an entity that people are familiar with east of the Mississippi River, but they basically do what the Army Corps of Engineers does, but they're specifically managing reservoirs and water supply in the West. And most of our reservoirs are not for flood control purposes or things like that. It's really for water supply. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard in the news lately, but Lake Powell is dipping below a critical level where hydropower cannot be generated. And so that's another very important component for reservoirs out west. So while there's a lot of similarities, it does look different out here, but our process is very similar to what the North Carolina group does.
Becky, I have to say, I was not familiar with the Bureau of Reclamation. I did not know that. What about something I've been learning a little about lately are like injecting water into aquifers for storage. Do y'all do that in Colorado?
So we do not, I mean, we have aquifers and groundwater, but most of the immediate needs are met with surface water from the rivers. And then the key to that, for example, one of the things coming up is in Arizona. And Arizona is a major water user of the Colorado River. And they also are a major user of groundwater, but they have now been, their state has now been charged with, you have to recover our groundwater in our state. But how do you do that? They're using Colorado River water. So it's not really a helpful thing because they're using water that, is supposed to be shared with, California, Nevada. And so it's a little bit more complicated in that we don't get to simply recharge our groundwater with just rainfall.
Interesting. And as a former classroom teacher, that kind of reminds me of the student that will come up and take something distributed to the whole class, but will take extra and stash it in their backpack or something. Something that was supposed to be shared with everyone, they'll go stash it. So that kind of reminds me of that kind of analogy.
That is very, very appropriate.
There's a lot of life skills in classroom teaching, that's for sure. Okay, so let's see here. Let's move into our misconceptions. How about that? But by the way, those were great overviews. Very well put. I'm going to try to see if I can share my screen again. I want to ask everyone. This is where I have to find it. There we go. Let's look at these misconceptions that we've come up with. And I want to ask folks joining us today, we'll read through them, but which one of these, whoops, I hit the wrong button. I can't talk and do things at the same time. But let's look at these, and which of these misconceptions do you maybe connect with, or which resonate with you? Number one is drought is determined simply by how much precipitation you have received. And if this resonates with you, put it in the chat. We want this to be kind of interactive here. The drought status is totally determined by one national author, which we kind of got into already. One rain event is enough to eliminate drought. How many of y'all are familiar with maybe folks who think that, or if you've thought that yourself? Abnormally dry conditions are the first sign of drought. What about my yard is wet, therefore there must not be a drought? And excuse me, you can't have a drought during the winter, which Becky mentioned a moment ago. And the last one we have listed here is if our future climate is wetter, we won't have that many droughts. So let's look in the chat and let's see which of these misconceptions are some, maybe resonate with you, or you've heard people voice these before. And based on that, Becky or Corey, if y'all want to kind of chime in and address these.
Yeah, the first one I see several people have said is, if your yard is wet, there's not a drought. So this is one that we hear a lot, and right now is a great example. There are some parts of North Carolina that have seen an inch or two of rain over the last few days. We had some thunderstorms move through a couple nights ago. So certainly there are places where the ground is wet. There may even be standing water in some spots. My answer to that is that drought is not just skin deep, the same as beauty. We talked about some of the other indicators that we look at, things like deeper soil moisture and groundwater conditions. These are all slower to respond to rain than your yard would be, than the topsoil will be. So that's why we do look at indicators like that, because they give us a better sense of how that more entrenched drought is recovering. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you have a heavy rain event where you may see an inch or two falling in one day, a lot of that rain is actually going to run off. it's not going to get soaked into the ground where some of those drier conditions have probably settled in. So, we're coming up on the summertime. Later this summer and the fall, we'll probably expect to see some tropical systems. If the coast of North Carolina is still in a drought, then after one of these tropical storms comes through, you'll probably see those types of impacts. You'll probably see, there may be flooding in some of the streets. You may have very wet conditions and puddles in people's yards and in farms. But at the same time, we may still have groundwater wells in that part of the state that are running a little bit low. It seems crazy to think about, you could get 6 inches of rain from a tropical storm or hurricane and still be in a drought, but it actually can happen. And again, it's just based on the different indicators that we look at and how we're valuing, say, those surface conditions versus some of the deeper conditions.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. So, and these are great points. I also see Alex in the chat. She said, so would you say that drought and runoff are closely correlated?
Drought and runoff are in some ways enemies. Anytime water is running off, it means it's not being used for good drought recovery, especially in the ground and with groundwater. So it's kind of a necessary evil. We like these big rain events that, especially a good soaking rain, but a lot of times our rain comes during this time of the year in these heavy downpours where we'll see rain at the surface, but also see some runoff. So at least runoff is usually good for helping with streams, with creeks, with lakes, but it doesn't always get into the ground where it's really needed.
We've had a unique issue in our mountains where when you have a wildfire, your soils become what the term is hydrophobic. And the soil has burned so hot that it's almost like a hard plastic. And so instead of the moisture being able to infiltrate into the ground, none of it can get in, all of it runs off, and you don't get any benefit from it. And then if that rain is heavy enough, it can actually gather a lot of the debris from the wildfire that burned 1 to 5 years ago and cause a lot of destruction, which it did on I-70 last summer, where we had a wildfire in a very steep sloping mountain terrain, and none of the water could be infiltrated. And it was about maybe 1.5 inches in a 15-minute period. And that was enough to completely wipe out the interstate. And it was closed for several weeks. And there were people working on that actually said that there were rocks unearthed that had not seen the light of day in probably 10,000 years. And so runoff, lots of rain, can sometimes be a very bad thing and not help with drought conditions at all.
That's interesting. And that makes me think of a question. And Corey, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if someone knows this off the top of their head, it's you. What do you think is the average amount of rainfall that North Carolina will see in one episode? What's like the average quantity that we see during like a wet season?
Yeah, so that's an interesting topic as well, is wet season versus dry season. One thing that makes North Carolina's climate pretty unique is that we get pretty much on average about the same amount of rain every season of the year, just about every month of the year. That's very different from what happens in the Western United States. But the one thing that really is different is how that rain tends to fall. Beginning in the fall and really going through around this time of the spring, usually late April, early May. Most of our precipitation comes from these frontal systems or low pressure systems. It tends to fall over a longer period of time. A cold frontal passage may take a day to move all the way across the state. So you'll probably see several hours, maybe close to a full day of pretty steady rain, sometimes snow falling. Once we start getting into mid to late May, really running on into later in the fall, more of our rain starts coming from what we call these convective events. Basically, it's, the atmosphere heats up during the daytime, that warm air rises, it creates clouds, and those clouds can build into thunderstorms. So you'll see more of these pop-up afternoon showers and thunderstorms. With those events, you can sometimes get the same amount of rain. You could easily see a quarter inch, half inch, even an inch or more of rainfall coming from a single storm. But again, it's coming over a lot shorter duration. Instead of it falling over 12 hours, 24 hours, sometimes it may only fall over 1 or 2 hours. So again, that sort of changes how that moisture will get infiltrated into the ground, or how in some cases it'll make it or not make it deeper into those deeper soils and groundwater conditions.
Corey, I love it. You just made a great point that I've always kind of known, but didn't really put the words on it. But we do have 2 totally different like seasons on how we get rain. But I did not realize that we have about the same amount each month. But yeah, we're definitely getting into that time of year where the convection will create that thunderhead, and you'll just get dropped on in the late afternoon.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm also seeing shout outs to Coco Raz in the chat. Edna collects precipitation reports for Coco Raz. If we can put a quick plug in for that, I would love to, because I, just full disclosure, I recently was gifted a super fancy rain gauge, and I put it up in my yard. And so this morning and every morning, my son he's 6. He loves to run outside and see how much rain we got. And we installed it like a couple weeks ago. So right in time for, a few rain events to come through. But yeah, so can y'all speak on Coco Raz for a moment? I'd love to get more people involved with that.
Yeah, I'll say, well, I guess, Becky, do you want to go first? Since I guess Coco Raz started in Colorado.
It did. So just a little bit of interesting history here. In the Colorado Climate Center is at the Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. The state climatologist prior to our current one, his name is Nolan Duskin, and he started Coco Raz in 1997. We had a major flood event in Fort Collins that according to the official observation at the one station we had closest to the storm, we got about 3 inches of precipitation from this event. And Nolan decided to kind of go out and solicit as much information as he could from all areas of Fort Collins to see if he could get at how much rain actually fell. And what was key is that the rain fell in a spot just west of town, and it actually found out that it was probably more close to like 11 to 12 inches of precipitation. And then what it did was it took our creek, Spring Creek, which flows through town, and it swelled it. And the runoff on Spring Creek, which is typically a creek, experienced a 1 in about 10,000 year event. And so it completely went over major roads. It wiped out a trailer park that was located near the creek. And there were a couple of fatalities, unfortunately. But Nolan realized that having many precipitation observations was really important, and that what happens in one area of town may not be representative of what's happening in another area of town or another area of town. And so kind of like Corey previously mentioned, when you're talking about summertime pop-up thunderstorms, they're not wide horizontally. And so what happens here is just happening here. Think of those pictures you see where you see that cloud just like, right? That rainfall is happening in this very local area. And depending on how the storm moves, some people very close by may completely miss out. And so starting Coco Raz was really important so that we could get as many observations from volunteers as possible. And then you could actually see where places were getting the moisture and where places weren't from any given event. And it started in Colorado. In fact, The first CO was for Colorado Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And then it was like, oh, well, maybe we should expand. This is successful. Let's expand to other states. And it became the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And since then, it has expanded nationally and been a really essential tool for getting at all those little location differences in daily precipitation.
Wow, excellent. Thanks, Becky. And Corey, I want to let you speak on it, on how it has been used in North Carolina. I know we've had some history with that.
That's right. Yeah. You know, for one, like Becky said, having a good network of CoCoRaHS observers is invaluable. It really helps us fill in the gaps, especially this time of the year when, you know, a shower may hit your area and then miss places 5 or 10 miles away. So, you know, knowing where that rain is falling is extremely valuable for us. Another really good and useful part of the CoCoRaHS program is called their condition monitoring program. If you're already a CoCoRaHS observer, you can join this and start doing this at any time. Basically, the idea is that you're the expert of your own backyard or you know, the surroundings in your area. So you'll be able to tell when conditions are getting a little bit wetter than they might normally be for this time of the year, or a little bit drier. What they encourage condition monitoring observers to do is just maybe once a week, once every couple weeks, just write up a short summary. You know, are you seeing any impacts of either abnormally wet conditions or abnormally dry conditions? This could be if you've got a garden, you know, are you having trouble getting plants started in the garden? Do you have to water it more often than you usually do? This could be if you've got a creek or a stream nearby. Are the levels looking a little bit low? Or if you've had a rain event, have the levels jumped up and have they stayed higher? Truly, these condition monitoring reports that we get from CoCoRaHS observers are some of the most valuable things we look at on our North Carolina drought calls every week, because they just help us validate all these other indicators that we're seeing and really get a sense of what's actually happening on the ground and what those drought impacts are.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks for that. I remember hearing something about during hurricanes that CoCoRaHS data became very helpful also in the aftermath.
In fact, during Hurricane Florence back in 2018, there was a CoCoRaHS observer down in Elizabethtown in Bladen County, truly a dedicated observer to be making rainfall measurements in the middle of a hurricane, but she had to go, you know, check her rain gauge regularly. The gauges themselves only hold 10 inches of rain. So once it fills up, you have to empty it and reset it. But she measured almost 36 inches of rain, you know, 3 feet worth of rain from that one hurricane event. And that's now our state record for the most rain during a tropical storm. So again, the dedication of our CoCoRaHS observers is always impressive.
Well, tying this back into, you know, people and how helpful they are with gathering this information, but also kind of extending that question into how is human population impacting drought and drought conditions and our water usage overall, you know, out in North Carolina, but also out west? What does it look like now and kind of moving into the future with this?
Yeah, I always think it's interesting to look back. It's actually been almost 100 years now since one of North Carolina's first really bad, really long-lived droughts in our recent history. Back in 1925 and 1926, we got into a really dry stretch. It lasted more than a year. One of the big differences back then is that we did not have most of these man-made reservoirs put in place yet. A lot of those were developed pretty much, you know, World War II era, sometime in the middle of the last century. So that made a lot of our bigger cities a lot more vulnerable. You know, they just didn't have that ready water supply. They would have probably been just taking water from, you know, in Raleigh from the Neuse River. And if the Neuse River was running low, then that was, you know, really bad because there really weren't any other great ways to get water if it wasn't raining. So when we look at changes that have happened over this past, you know, almost 100 years since that event, of course, you know, the building of these big man-made reservoirs around Raleigh, you've got Falls Lake and Jordan Lake. In other parts of the state, you've got some other large water supplies and reservoirs. You know, that's been one of the big things that has helped us be able to weather these droughts as well as we can. Because, you know, as long as it doesn't stretch for 2 or 3 years, like that 2007 and 2008 drought, generally we'll be able to hang on to at least a sufficient water supply. So, you know, you've still got water, you know, flowing through the taps in your house. But the other big change that we've seen since then is the population growth. North Carolina's population basically tripled over that period. And we know, it's still growing in a lot of spots, especially in some of our big cities. So that means that water that we do store has to go a lot longer. It has to supply more people. So in some ways, it's just been a tug of war. It's been increasing our ability to supply, but also increasing the number of people that need to be supplied. And one other big change we've seen, especially in terms of, how humans have moved around and things in the last century or so, is just we've paved over a lot more of our land surface. Well, what happens when rain falls on a paved surface? Well, it runs off. So that, again, just means during heavy rain events, you're just not trapping as much of that water in the ground. More of it's running off. And again, some of that may eventually make it into streams, into rivers. But if rain falls over downtown Raleigh and it's falling on a parking lot, well, it's probably not going to reach deeper into the ground there. So that's been another sort of push and pull aspect of increased development.
The way that you just described our reservoirs kind of made me think of them as like a battery. And now we've got a lot more people that are pulling on that water battery.
Right. Yeah, that is a great way to think about it. We can recharge them better than we used to, but also we can drain them more quickly with more people now. Is
there looking into how to manage water and divert it more, so like in downtown Raleigh, for example, or so that it makes it more confidence, makes it into one of our reservoirs or into a stream? Is that, I'm sure that's part of city planning, right? Or
yeah, in some ways, this sort of goes back to what stormwater managers are doing. They're looking at ways to make sure that we are capturing more of that water that falls and would otherwise run off. Just adding more green spaces to cities is one good, helpful way to do that. It doesn't totally solve the problem, but just adding, watershed buffers in green spaces can help that a bit.
I want to address some of the questions that are in the chat in the last couple minutes here. What effect will increased wind have on drought? That's an interesting question. Is there a correlation there?
Certainly, it'll speed up the type of impacts that we're seeing. And in parts of North Carolina, we saw that just a month or so ago. We had some pretty windy days back, late March and then during the month of April. And what we were seeing, especially in parts of the coast where they hadn't been seeing much rain, is that any rain that fell was getting evaporated very quickly because that wind was blowing. You can think about if you were to step out of the shower and step in front of a fan. Well, that water on your skin is going to evaporate very quickly. You're moving more air over it, so that's increasing the evaporation rate. So essentially, that's the role that wind plays with drought, is it just bumps up that evaporation rate, and it does mean water is a little bit tougher to keep around, especially right on the ground or right on your plants.
Excellent. Thanks. And Caroline asked, she mentioned another misconception, which this is very common, and it has to do with more than just drought, but what it means to have a 1 in 100, 1,000, or 10,000 year weather event. Could y'all hit on that real quick?
Sure, I can take that. So the misconception is say you have a 1 in 100 year event, that means you're not going to have another one for another 100 years, which is not the case. So when we say 1 in 100, we've done some statistical analysis to find that at any given time period, there's a 1% chance of that event happening. So say you have for a day, a 1 in 100 event, that means that there was a 1% chance that the rainfall would hit that amount on that day. Now, the next day, there is also a 1% chance that you could get that amount in one day. It doesn't reset just because you had it. And so when we say a 1 in 10,000 year event, that means that, there's like a 0.01% chance, which means it's very rare, but that doesn't mean that that chance is eliminated once it happens. It's kind of like, think of when you're playing roulette in Vegas and you've landed on red. That does not mean that there's 100% chance that you're going to get black next just because 50-50. If I get red, that means the next one will be black. Nope, you still have a 50-50 chance. And then the next one, you still have a 50-50 chance. Your chances don't change because you have that one event. And then the other misconception that I would say about these events, and it was in my head and then I kept talking and now it left my head, is that it's location specific. So you can have an event that is 1 in 1,000 here, and then, you know, a couple years later have another event over here. That doesn't impact the fact that you had that 1 in 1,000 event here and then another one here, which is why we can see when you look all over the country, these extreme events happening, because you have a lot of locations that have these risks on every single day. So if you think about the fact of, you know, it's really hard for you to win the lottery, but every week somebody somewhere in the country is winning the lottery. It doesn't mean that those chances are better. It just means that, you know, there's that many opportunities. So even though it's a rare event, it's happening somewhere. And we see that same thing with extreme events in climate, that they're happening everywhere, and they're still extreme and they're still rare. But, you know, you have enough going on when you look across the country that somewhere a rare event is going to happen.
And I'll add, you know, one story from my perspective about this. It's kind of a sad story. Back after Hurricane Matthew hit in the fall of 2016, there was a group out of East Carolina that brought together different scientists and also people from some of the communities that have been affected by Matthew. And one memory I'll have that I don't think I'll ever go away is the fire chief from the town of Windsor in northeastern North Carolina stood up and said they were hit by Hurricane Floyd back in 1999. They were told the amount of rain they saw during Floyd was a 1 in 500 year event. They had another storm come through in a decade after that. It was called the 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 year event. Then they had Matthew that hit the previous fall, and it was another 1 in 500 year event. He said, I've got people in my town that think they're 1,100 years old because they've had these events in such a short time. So, that sort of drove home two things for me. One is that the way that we describe these events is maybe not the best. It can't be misconstrued that way. But another is that, this sort of takes us into the climate change aspect, is that these events are coming more common. We are seeing heavier rainfall from especially tropical storms and hurricanes. So the way that we've always seen these events happen and watched them play out is not going to be the same way they play out now or 20 years from now. So again, from the places that have been hardest hit by these events, these are the kinds of lessons that we can take.
This is a great discussion, and I am going to have to put a little stop in it. I'm going to stop recording, but before I do, I want to thank everyone for being here and sharing your morning with us. And I definitely want to thank our awesome speakers, Corey and Becky. You guys are phenomenal, and I'm so glad that you were able to share your knowledge with us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. It's been great.
This is the part I'm going to